Well, hey there, folks. Good to see ya. If you're new here, welcome. Glad you found your way in. My name's Cal. If you want the full backstory on who I am and what we're trying to build in this here shop, there's a watch this first video sitting right at the top of the playlist. Now, this video is part of our Walking Through It series, where we take all the tools and ideas we've been working on over in the Thinking Through It series out of the shed and get them a little dirty by working with some real-world stuff. If you haven't been following along over there, that's okay. We'll try to give you enough to work with. Just keep in mind that the Thinking Through It series is where you can go to learn more if you find yourself wondering just what in the hell we're talking about. Let's get to work. Recently, the Pentagon released a big old batch of declassified files about UFOs, videos, photos, documents, some of them going all the way back to the 1940s. Just put them on a website. Said, here you go, make up your own minds. And the internet, well, the internet did what the internet does. Some folks went straight to told you so. Little green men, confirmed. Some folks said it was nothing but weather balloons and swamp gas dressed up in fancy government language. Some folks said the only reason they're releasing it now is because they want you looking over there while something else is going on over here. And a few folks, not nearly enough of them, stopped and asked a different question altogether. Not what is it, but how do I think about this? That's the question we're going to work through today. I'll be straight with you up front. We're not going to solve the UFO question in the next 30 minutes or so. Nobody is. What we are going to do is use it. Because how a person responds to something like this, something genuinely unexplained, with incomplete evidence, and a whole lot of people yelling at each other about it, well, that right there is a perfect test case for everything we've been working on. Personal theology, worldview, critical thinking. You want to know what a person actually believes about the nature of reality? Watch what they do with a question they can't fully answer. That'll tell you more about them than just about anything else. So let's start with what we actually know. And I do mean know, not what somebody on YouTube claims, not what your uncle swears happened to his buddy back in 1987. What the government has now officially put on paper and said, we don't know what this is. The government has been tracking what they now call UAPs, unidentified anomalous phenomena, for decades. Most folks still call them UFOs. That's fine. We'll use both terms. In 2022, the Department of Defense set up something called the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, the AARO, specifically to collect, analyze, and report on these sightings. In 2023, a former member of a Pentagon intelligence task force sat down in front of a congressional committee and testified under oath that the United States government has extraterrestrial spacecraft in its possession and knew exactly where they were being kept. That's not a tabloid headline. That is sworn congressional testimony. The Pentagon came back and said they found no evidence to support that claim. So you've got a guy under oath saying one thing and the institution he worked for saying the opposite. File that away, we'll come back to it. A while ago, under a directive from President Trump, the Pentagon released what they're calling the first batch of never-before-seen declassified UAP files. Over 160 records, videos, photos, documents, from the FBI, the Department of Defense, NASA, and the State Department. Sightings from the 1940s all the way up through late 2025. Military pilots describing objects making 90-degree turns at 80 miles an hour. Objects visible only on infrared that disappear instantaneously. Orbs launching other orbs. A composite photo built from multiple eyewitness accounts of a metallic ellipsoid object bigger than a drone, smaller than a 737, that materialized out of a bright light in the sky and then vanished. And the official Pentagon position after reviewing all of it, we don't know what it is, not its aliens, not its weather balloons. We don't know what it is. not it's aliens, not it's weather balloons. We don't know. Now, I want you to sit with that for just a second, because that answer, we don't know, is actually more significant than it sounds. This isn't some underfunded local sheriff's department saying they don't know. This is the most powerful military apparatus in the history of the world. With satellite systems that can read a license plate from orbit, radar networks that can track a sparrow through a thunderstorm, pilots with thousands of hours of flight time and some of the best sensor equipment ever built under their wings, and their official answer is, we don't know what it is. That's worth taking seriously. It's also worth noticing what happened the moment those files dropped. People didn't wait for analysis. They didn't ask for context. They didn't look at the evidence and then form a conclusion. They went straight to whatever they already believed. And that, right there, is exactly what we've been talking about in the Thinking Through It series. Your worldview doesn't wait for an invitation. It shows up first, every time. The question isn't whether your worldview is going to shape how you see this. It already did. The question is whether you're going to examine it while it's doing that, or just let it run. Before we get into the three positions folks tend to on this topic, I want to say something about how we're going to handle this. I'm not setting these up to knock them down. Each one has real people behind it who came to it for real reasons. Our job is to look at the worldview machinery running underneath each one, run it through the critical thinking tools we've been building, and see where it holds up and where it starts to strain. That's it. No dunking, no dismissing, no pretending one side is all geniuses and the other side is just a bunch of idiots. Just honest pressure testing. Which, if you've been with us through the last few episodes, you should be getting pretty comfortable with by now. Position A. There's a natural explanation. We just haven't found it yet. This is where your rationalist lands. Your scientific purists. The person who spent their career in a lab, or who's read enough science to know that human beings have a pretty impressive track record of eventually explaining things that used to seem impossibly mysterious. Lightning used to be God's judgment. Epilepsy used to be demonic possession. The sun moving across the sky used to be a chariot, and every single time patient scientific inquiry eventually came up with a natural explanation that held up under pressure. So the rationalist looks at UAP footage and says, we just haven't figured it out yet. Could be advanced atmospheric phenomena we don't fully understand. Could be secret military technology, ours or somebody else's. Could be sensor artifacts, instrument errors, plasma formations, a whole lot of things that don't require anything outside the natural order to explain. The worldview machinery underneath this position is called naturalism. The basic claim is, matter is all there is. The physical universe is the whole show. Everything that happens, everything that can happen, has a physical cause. There is no supernatural. There's just the natural and the not yet explained natural. The critical thinking tools that back this position up are solid ones. The first one is called Occam's razor. The basic idea is, when you've got multiple explanations for something, the one that requires the fewest assumptions is usually the right one. If a light in the sky can be explained by a weather balloon, you don't need to drag in alien spacecraft to account for it. Simpler explanation wins until the evidence forces you to reach for a more complicated one. The second tool is the burden of proof. The claim that there are extraterrestrial craft operating in Earth's atmosphere is an extraordinary claim, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Blurry infrared footage of something moving in an unusual way doesn't clear that bar. Pilot testimony, however credible the pilot, doesn't clear that bar either. The rationalist isn't being stubborn or close-minded by holding that line. They're being precise about what evidence actually demonstrates. That's good thinking. So where does this position hold up? It holds up well on discipline. It resists wild leaps. It demands evidence before conclusion. It's kept humanity from chasing a whole lot of dead ends. Where does it start to strain? Here's where it gets interesting. The rationalist position works fine right up until the evidence starts piling up in a direction that a natural explanation genuinely struggles to account for. Objects making instantaneous 90-degree turns at speeds no known aircraft can achieve, in a medium that should tear apart any physical structure trying to do that. That starts to put real pressure on. We just haven't found the natural explanation yet. Think about what that actually means for a second. If you put a jar of something up on a shelf in the kitchen, and you come back the next morning and the lid's off, you figure you forgot to close it. Fine. Happens. You come back the next morning and the lid's off again. Okay, maybe you did it again. Third morning, lid's off. At some point, you stop blaming yourself and start wondering if somebody else is getting into the kitchen. That's what 80 years of not yet starts to feel like. The explanation that made sense on day one starts to cost more and more the longer it has to carry the load. And there's something about Occam's razor that sometimes gets missed. It says the explanation requiring the fewest assumptions wins. But if the evidence keeps accumulating in a way that a natural explanation can only account for by piling assumption on top of assumption, at some point the razor cuts the other direction. The rationalist position also carries a worldview assumption that rarely gets examined out loud. The claim that matter is all there is not a scientific conclusion. Science can tell you what it observes in the natural world, but it cannot tell you there's nothing outside the natural world to observe. That's a philosophical position, a theological one even. And it's fine to hold it. But let's not pretend it's a neutral starting point. Some folks use naturalism the same way a superstitious fella uses a lucky rabbit's foot, not because they've tested every inch of the woods, but because it makes them feel safe to think they've got the whole boundary line mapped out. Naturalism ought to be held honestly, as a worldview commitment, not passed off as a scientific fact. The rationalist who doesn't examine that assumption is doing the same thing they'd criticize a religious person for doing. Reaching a conclusion first, then fitting the evidence to it. And here's where it gets personal. Most people who land on position A aren't professional scientists. They're regular folks who've absorbed a cultural message that says smart people don't believe in things they can't prove. And that message has been in the water for long enough that a lot of people have swallowed it whole without ever actually examining whether it's true. Which is a little ironic, because accepting a worldview without examining it is exactly what the scientific mindset is supposed to prevent. So if you're in position A, good, just make sure you're there because you've actually looked at the machinery underneath it. Not because somebody told you that's where the smart people stand. Position B, there's something beyond the natural going on here. This is a bigger tent than it looks like from the outside. Christians, New Age folks, people who describe themselves as spiritual but not religious are all in there. A significant chunk of the general population who just intuitively feel like the material world isn't the whole story, they're in there too. And honestly, that really is most people, historically speaking. The idea that reality includes more than what we can see, measure, and quantify isn't some fringe position. It's the overwhelming consensus of human experience across every culture and every century. Every civilization that has ever existed, every one, develops some framework for a reality beyond the physical. That's not evidence on its own, but it is worth noticing. When something shows up in every kitchen across every culture that's ever cooked a meal, you at least gotta ask why. The worldview machinery underneath this position is what you might call a supernaturalist framework. The belief that there is a reality beyond the physical and that it can interact with the physical world. The people in this tent don't all agree on what that non-physical reality looks like. The Christian says it's the God of Scripture, a personal being who created the physical world and operates above and within it. The New Age crowd might say it's some kind of universal consciousness or energy field. Some folks think UAPs are interdimensional beings. Some think they're demonic, others think they're angelic. What they all share is the conviction that the physical world isn't all there is. The critical thinking tool doing most of the work here is called inference to the best explanation. The basic idea is, when you've got a body of evidence, the best explanation is the one that most completely and coherently accounts for all of it. Think of it like tracking an animal in the snow. You see a print that looks like a boot, but it's 18 inches wide and sinks 2 inches deep into frozen ground. You can try to tell yourself a very heavy fellow with giant feet went out for a stroll. Or you can start considering that you just might be tracking something you ain't never seen before. That's inference. You look at the depth of the track, not just the shape. If you've got credible military witnesses, consistent behavioral patterns across thousands of sightings over decades, objects demonstrating capabilities that violate known physics, and a government that spent decades actively denying their existence and now can't explain them either, the person in this tent says a framework that includes a non-physical reality actually explains that data more completely than one that doesn't. That's not an unreasonable move. For the Christian specifically, there's a relevant note worth making here. Scripture doesn't say a whole lot about UAPs directly. It wasn't written to answer that question, but it does describe a reality that includes created beings operating in dimensions we can't fully see or understand. It describes a physical world that is real, but not ultimate, and that it exists within a larger created order. So a biblical worldview can accommodate the existence of things in the physical world that we don't understand and can't explain. It doesn't require a particular answer for what UAPs are. It doesn't forbid one either. A Christian thinker can look at the evidence honestly and say, I don't know what that is, but my framework has room for things I can't fully account for. That's not intellectual laziness. That's honest humility. Where does this position hold up? It takes seriously the full range of human experience, not just what's measurable. It doesn't require one to do mental gymnastics to explain away consistent, credible, documented phenomena. It sits within a broader framework that has explanatory power way beyond the UFO question. Where does it strain? The risk here is confirmation bias, and I want to spend a minute on this one because it's sneaky. Confirmation bias is what happens when your brain starts treating evidence like a filter instead of like a scale. A scale weighs everything that comes in. A filter only lets through what fits. When you already believe in a non-physical reality, every unexplained phenomenon becomes potential confirmation. The UAP moves in a way physics can't account for. That's consistent with my framework. The government can't explain it? Of course they can't. They're only looking in the natural world. And the thing is, those responses might be right, but they might also just be the filter doing its job. The test is whether you're actually weighing the evidence or just sorting it. And the honest way to check that is to ask yourself, what would count against my position? What evidence would make me say, okay, that points away from the supernatural explanation? If you can answer that clearly, you're using a scale. If every piece of evidence, no matter what it shows, somehow ends up confirming what you already believed, you're using a filter. And a filter isn't a thinking tool, it's just a worldview with extra steps. Here's where it gets personal for the folks in this tent. There's a version of position B that's genuinely examined and carefully held, and there's a version that's just emotional comfort dressed up as theology. The difference usually shows up under pressure. When something comes in that doesn't fit the supernatural explanation, when the evidence points toward a perfectly boring natural cause for a particular sighting, does the person in position B update, or does the filter kick in and find a way to keep the narrative intact? That's the tell. A faith that can't survive contact with inconvenient evidence isn't actually a faith built on honest thinking. It's just a preference with a cross on it. The tent is also big, which means it includes a lot of people who haven't thought carefully about which non-physical reality they're invoking or why. Something beyond the natural is a starting point, not a conclusion. If you're going to land there, you owe it to yourself and to the question to be precise about what you actually mean. Position C, it's ours, theirs, or we're being managed. I want to spend a minute on the dignity of this position before I start pressuring it. Because this is the tent that a significant chunk of the rural, working-class folks, my kind of people, live in, and they got there for real reasons. The United States government has a well-documented history of lying to its citizens, running secret programs it denied for decades that turned out to be real, and classifying information not to protect national security but to protect from institutional embarrassment. Specifically on this topic, they actively mocked and discredited credible witnesses for 60 years. You know what they called people who reported seeing something they couldn't explain? Crazy, attention seekers, conspiracy theorists, career military pilots with spotless records and thousands of hours in the cockpit. Called crazy for reporting exactly what the government just finally admitted it's known all along and can't explain. If your first response to that is skepticism, you are not being irrational, you are paying attention. The worldview machinery underneath position C is a specific theology of power and institutions. The basic belief is that large institutions, governments, militaries, intelligence agencies have interests that are not the same as the interests of the people they serve. That information is a tool of control, that what gets released, and when it gets released, and how it gets framed, is rarely an accident. And that transparency from a historically dishonest institution deserves to be interrogated before it gets accepted. That's not paranoia. That's pattern recognition. The critical thinking tool doing the work here is another Latin phrase, cui bono, just means who benefits. When an institution that spent decades hiding something suddenly decides to be transparent about it, it's worth asking why. Why now? Why this administration? Why these particular files and not others? What isn't being released in all this rolling disclosure? Those are legitimate questions, every one of them. And here's the thing, there are real documented answers to some of them that aren't flattering to the government at all. The secret weapons testing angle deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms. A significant portion of what gets reported as UAP could plausibly be advanced drone technology, hypersonic vehicles in development, foreign adversary aircraft operating in ways we haven't publicly acknowledged. You've got to remember the government's first obligation is to keep us safe, and sometimes keeping us safe means keeping us in the dark. Think about this from a military intelligence standpoint for a second. If China has developed something that can outmaneuver our best aircraft, and our pilots are seeing it in restricted airspace, the last thing the government wants is for that to become public knowledge. Because then China knows we know. And then the whole strategic advantage evaporates. In that scenario, we don't know what it is exactly what they'd say, whether they really knew or not. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's basic strategic logic. Where does position C hold up? Institutional skepticism is earned in this case. The historical record supports it. The secret technology explanation accounts for a real portion of what's been reported. Demanding to know why something is being released right now is good thinking, not paranoia. Where does it start to strain? Here's the problem. Position C, taken far enough, becomes a theory that can't be proven wrong no matter what evidence comes in. If the government releases files, that's them managing the narrative. If they don't release files, that's them hiding things. If a whistleblower comes forward, they're either a plant or a patsy. If the whistleblower gets discredited, that proves the cover-up is real. You see the problem? When every piece of evidence, including evidence that contradicts your position, gets interpreted as proof of your position, you're not thinking anymore. You're just defending, and a position you can't be argued out of, no matter what shows up, isn't a conclusion you arrived at through honest inquiry. It's a fortress. And fortresses feel safe, but they're not actually a place you can think from. They're a place you hide. And the trouble with hiding in a fortress for 40 years is that eventually the windows get so caked with dust you can't even see the weather changing outside. You think you're protecting yourself from lies, but you've actually just built a jail cell where the truth isn't allowed to visit you either. There's a useful question that separates healthy skepticism from a closed loop. What would change my mind? Sit with that one honestly. Not what would it take to prove it absolutely beyond any doubt, because that bar is so high nothing clears it and you know it. Just what kind of evidence, if it showed up, would genuinely move you? If you've got an honest answer to that, you're thinking. If the answer keeps sliding around every time you try to pin it down, that's not skepticism. That's just a worldview wearing skepticism's clothes. And it's just as much a failure of critical thinking as blind belief. It just feels smarter. So, 3 positions. 3 different sets of worldview machinery running underneath them. 3 different sets of critical thinking tools being applied, some well, some not. Where do I land? Well, I'll be honest about where my own worldview is doing work here before I tell you. I already believe in a created reality that is bigger than what I can see and measure. I already believe that the physical world exists within a larger created order that includes things I can't fully account for. That doesn't tell me what UAPs are, but it does mean I'm not surprised when the physical world turns up things it can't explain on its own terms. My personal theology has room for that, based on the evidence available. The credible pilot testimony, the consistent behavioral characteristics across thousands of sightings, the documented government acknowledgement that they genuinely don't know what it is, and the physical characteristics of some of these objects that strain any natural explanation I've come across. I find it harder and harder to sit comfortably in position A. The "we just haven't found the natural explanation yet" answer has been the answer for 80 years. At some point, "not yet" starts to look less like patience and more like commitment to a conclusion. Does that mean they're alien spacecraft? I don't know. Does it mean they're interdimensional beings? I don't know. Does it mean the government is hiding recovered craft and non-human biologics like that whistleblower testified? I genuinely don't know. What I can say is this. Based on the information and evidence available to me right now, after running it through my own worldview and theology sources as honestly as I can, the explanation that requires the fewest strained assumptions is one that acknowledges we're dealing with something that the purely naturalist framework is having a genuinely hard time accounting for. That's not aliens confirmed. That's just honest. I haven't seen enough yet to plant my flag in any one camp. Now here's the part one want you to stay with me on, because this is the part that matters most. Not where I land, but what to do with the fact that 2 careful, honest people can look at the same evidence and land in genuinely different places. That bothers some folks. If you've done the work honestly and arrived at the right answer, shouldn't everybody who does the work honestly arrive at the same answer? Maybe. But here's what's actually going on. When evidence is incomplete, and on the UAP question, it is incomplete, your worldview has to carry some of the weight. It fills in the gaps. Not dishonestly, not lazily, just necessarily. Think of it like 2 experienced farmers looking at the same stretch of fence around their chicken coops at the end of a long day. One of them has been keeping chickens for 30 years and has never once had a predator problem. The other one lost half her flock to a fox 3 winters back. They look at the same gap in the wire. One of them says wind took it down. We can fix it in the morning. The other one says something got through there. We're moving the flock tonight. Same gap, same fence, same evidence, different conclusions, because different experience shaped what each of them fills in when the evidence runs out. Neither one of them is being unreasonable. They're both working from what they actually know. That's what worldview does. 2 people can have 2 genuinely different but internally consistent worldviews. 2 people can apply the same critical thinking tools with equal care and equal honesty. And when the evidence runs out before the question does, they're gonna fill the remainder with what they actually believe about the nature of reality. And if they believe different things about the nature of reality, they're gonna land in different places. That's not a failure of thinking. That's just what honest thinking looks like when the data isn't settled. The person in position A who has genuinely examined their naturalist worldview and still holds it, and applied the burden of proof honestly, and is still sitting there saying, "I'm not convinced," that person has earned their position. I disagree with them, but I respect the work. The person in position C who has genuinely asked what would change their mind, and has an honest answer, and is still skeptical of the whole thing. Same thing. Earned. What none of us get to do is hold a position we haven't actually examined. What none of us get to do is let our gut reaction stand in for actual thinking, because your gut reaction is just your worldview talking before your brain wakes up. And your worldview, remember, is either something you built on purpose or something that got built for you by your upbringing, your culture, the people around you, what you've been watching and reading your whole life. One of those is yours. The other one is just inherited furniture. And you can't tell the difference until you actually go through the house and look at each piece, pick it up, turn it over, ask where it came from and whether you'd actually choose it if you were starting from scratch. Some of it you'll keep. Some of it you'll realize you only have because somebody put it there before you were old enough to have an opinion about it. Either way, now it's yours to deal with. That's the work. So next time something like this comes across your feed, something unexplained, contested, something that makes people yell at each other, try it. Before you react, pause. Ask yourself, what worldview is running underneath my reaction right now? What theology sources am I pulling from? What critical thinking tools should I be applying here? And what would actually change my mind? That last one's the most important. If you can answer it honestly, you're thinking. If you can't, you're just repeating. And we can do better than that. We've been building the tools. Now we're learning to use them. That's what today was actually about. Not UFOs. The UFOs were just a good excuse to get the tools out and take them for a test drive. Because if we can't be honest about lights in the sky, we aren't going to stand a chance when the questions start knocking on our own front doors. Next time around, we're going to do it again, but with something a little closer to the bone. Near-death experiences. People who've come back from the edge and described something that the purely naturalist framework has a real hard time dismissing. Same tools. Harder question, should be a good one. Thanks for stopping by. Before I let you get back to your day, I just wanted to say, thank you. It really means a lot to me that you'd take the time to sit here and listen to my yapping. Time is the only thing they're not making any more of. So thank you for spending a little bit of yours with me. Do me a favor, would ya? Do the YouTube dance, hit the thumb, the subscribe button and the little bell. It'll really help us out. And leave me a comment. Tell me what you liked, what you didn't like, what you want us to go over. Hell, tell me what you're having for dinner if you want. I want to get to know ya. I'll see you next time. Until then, take care.
I don't have all the answers, never claimed to know it all. Just an old farm kid still learning, working it out with y'all.